Hello, folks. My name is Mark. I am a friend of Cam's and bid you good evening. Thanks for joining us tonight. Cam is just joining us with his guests, and just wanted to point your attention if you're new to Zoom and you're a little bit uncertain what's going to happen here. We're going to keep everyone unmuted. We would love you to find your name either in the video list or the participants list, and if you roll over it, you should have the option to rename yourself. And so if you wanted to put your real name, I see a lot of you have already. Also, feel free to put your the place you're joining us from, and we'd love to know, see where everybody is coming from. We're going to. There's a couple of things that you can do, by the way. You can, up in the top right-hand corner of Zoom, you can click on the little grid of dots to change from speaker view, which is what you're looking at right now. So if this is working for you well, because I'm speaking, my big face is occupying most of the video screen. But you can also click gallery view. And gallery view will allow you to see that this is indeed a big group of smiling faces of real people. This is a community gathering as much as anything else. And we'd love you to leave your video on and leave yourself muted for now. As we get into the Q&A and the discussion, we'll be pulling some people forward, and we'll be allowing you, sending you a command to unmute when that happens. But let's just leave it at that for now. And ladies and gentlemen, I would love to go ahead. Oh, where is Cam? Are you there, Cam? There he is. Ladies and gentlemen, over to the one and only Cam Brewer.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. Welcome to joining us this evening for this Zoom event. And thank you, Mark, for getting us well set up here. Despite this being an online event and us each joining from different parts of the province, I want to start by recognizing that I am here on the unceded ancestral territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and I'd like to thank those nations for stewarding these lands for millennia. This is tonight the first in a series of chats that I'll be having over the next few weeks with leaders in different areas that have really stepped up to help articulate solutions. And I'm quite excited that we're kicking off this series with forestry. It's not only the issue that I cut my teeth as an environmentalist thinking about solutions to the way we interact with forests, but it's also an excellent example of our broken relationship with nature and also incredible opportunities for mending those relationships. So we'll use this as a great kickoff to the subsequent events. And joining me tonight is a familiar face from at least last week's first chat meeting where I introduced myself and we had a good conversation is Anna Yamoka. She's a graduate from law school at Oxford and now stepped up as our volunteer communications director on the campaign. So welcome, Anna. Anna's going to be facilitating your questions from everyone participating in the later part of the meeting, so starting around 6:30 or so. And of course, it's my great honor and pleasure to introduce my friend and mentor, Herb Hammond. Herb and I met in the early 90s, almost 30 years ago, when I was writing my thesis in graduate school on ecoforestry in British Columbia. And of course, I had to, at the time, like everybody else, read Herb's award-winning book, Seeing the Forest Among the Trees. And I remember thinking before I met Herb, I better memorize every single thing in that book before I talk to Herb. But it turns out that Herb is not only a principled and brilliant person, but he's also really a great guy to talk to, as you'll see tonight if you've never had a chance to chat with Herb in the past. And the research that I did for my thesis in graduate school led to working with Herb and his team at the Silva Forest Foundation, where we certified the first ecoforestry operations in British Columbia, worked with amazing woodlots and indigenous logging operations and community forest and value-added operations. Had a really great time. So tonight, Herb and I are going to have another one of our chats. So welcome, Herb.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
So before we start into the content, Herb, I think what I'll do is just provide a bit of a context of forestry in BC, where we are in 2020 with the forest. And the starting place is relationship with forests. The next important point in the context is that 95% of the forest in this province is public land, which means that there's an obligation to manage those forests for public benefits. So those two context pieces are really important. We've in the last 30 years really moved from the performance-based forest practices code to professional reliance, to a model in which public oversight is significantly removed and put in the hands of professionals working for private timber companies. The climate emergency, another, of course, critical part of that context, brought about the pine beetle infestation, and the response to that was to raise significant swaths of land across the province and cut down not just the pine trees, but also the spruce and the fir, and then sell those off all for 25 cents a cubic meter, a shockingly low price for public resources to private interest. And now, in 2020, is increasingly in the news and increasingly being studied. Rachel Holt's study with her colleagues recently, and the protests we're now seeing around the province emerge again about old growth, is that we're cutting the last little bits of old growth that remain, the last fragments of productive valley bottom old growth in the province. And at the same time, entertaining this idea that we should somehow increase the cut dramatically and export products such as biofuels. So cut these forests into little pieces and burn them. So these are some of the contextual pieces around forestry. And Herb, does that set the stage properly? Do you have anything to add?
No, I think that's good. I think we can expand that to say that all of those things resulted from an ill-conceived relationship with forests that needs to change.
Great, sure. And we're going to explore that relationship in a number of different aspects tonight with our conversation initially, and then with conversations or questions from participants. So I'm going to start just by asking some big picture questions, and we'll begin the dialogue. First of all, how do we restore? I just mentioned the cutting of old growth, the context of the pine beetle infestation caused by climate change, the decades of fragmented forests because of the way we've been cutting and mismanaging forests. So how do we restore the ecological integrity in our forests, and doing that in the context of that climate emergency, but also in the context of the biodiversity crisis?
Well, it's absolutely essential that we do that, and we need to start from a really basic understanding when it comes to the climate emergency, and that's that forests, particularly old forests, old growth forests, primary forests, are the best terrestrial carbon sink that we have. And so the more intact they are, the more they function to save our bacon in a way, especially in the time of the climate emergency and biodiversity crisis. Those are things that we worked on a lot when you were at Silva, and continued working on. And the essence of that is that the way to do that is to design networks of protected ecosystems from the whole of the landscape right down to individual sites. It's nested from big landscapes through watersheds down to sites. And that within that nested network of protection, we're able to find more employment than we find now. And we have to be really cognizant in the climate era of building climate resilience into those forests. So some of it's going to look different than it would have 50 years ago, but it's still going to maintain forests. And that's kind of the essence of where we want to go.
So you mentioned at the beginning of that the idea that old growths are going to save our bacon, as you put it. The idea that old growths are so important in sequestering carbon. There's a misconception out there, though, that plantation forests will grow quickly and hold carbon, whereas old growth forests won't. And maybe you can talk about that a little bit, but related to this, of course, is the use of the wood products. You know, if we cut down trees and make them into short-use wood products, at the one extreme would be biofuels, where we simply burn, release the carbon immediately. Another would be commodities that have a short-term use, and that gets to how we use wood products over the longer term. But just focusing on the forest itself, so it's the old-growth forests are actually better at sequestering and holding carbon than new plantations or new growing forests of any kind. Is that right?
Well, yes, you can, old growth forests and old forests, let's just call them old forests, so and primary forests that are all intact, do a very credible job. The older they are, generally, the better they are. But if you want to think about it this way, when you cut down an old growth temperate rainforest on Vancouver Island or up and down the coast of BC, and ship it away as logs, it will take at least 250 years to get back to the same level of carbon sequestration and storage as what you just undid. If you want to transport that to the interior, if you're looking at interior rainforests, it's probably in the neighborhood of about 200 upwards to that 250. If you go into subboreal and boreal forests in northern BC, now you're talking about 100 to 150. So you know, it's not like these are light decisions to cut down those terrestrial carbon sinks. It's not something you go to the hardware store, buy a new old growth forest and bring it back out and stick it in. It doesn't work that way.
So we do that then, we protect those carbon sinks, and then the restoration piece that works around it, you talked about the networks. And and now there's going to be more restoration than there would have been 30 years ago or even earlier than that. So we're now in a position where there's perhaps less of a focus on protection and more of a focus on restoration. Is that right?
Yes, there's more of a focus on restoration, and restoration will result in a lot of the thinning and climate change resilience that comes with restoration will provide small products that can be made into value-added products. We don't have to go rob the old growth store to get that. We can do that from building climate change resilience and restoration. And your work with the Eco Lumber Co-op is a model for that. I mean, that kind of model needs to be back front and center in order to accomplish that kind of value added.
So that model, so people know what we're talking about too, starts with the nature-based planning, the networks at multiple spatial scales in the forest that you've been discussing, and then ensures that the wood that we do cut, the products that come out of it, find their home in a variety of different places and appropriate places that add value and create more jobs locally in that community. And when we look at more restoration focus though, how does the job piece fit in if we're now doing more restoration work?
Well, an interesting way to think about restoration and jobs that is something that I refer to as a carbon tax on cutting trees. And a carbon tax, that if we had a carbon tax that what increased the older and larger the tree is for cutting, and we took the revenue from any cutting, which you would always get revenue, even cutting small trees will generate revenue, but you want to create a disincentive for dealing with old and large trees. You take that money then is put into restoration activities and climate change resilience. And the wood that comes from that isn't seen as the primary thing, it's seen as a byproduct. And that byproduct then goes into the value added stream. And all of that approach that I'm describing to you of building resilience through restoration is much more labor intensive. So it creates a lot more jobs per dollar spent and free cut than current mechanized logging systems, whether we're talking about the coast or the interior. So that's kind of the network of how you build jobs through that. And those are really good jobs. You know, people will feel good because they're healing jobs, not exploiting jobs.
Right, right. Okay, no, that makes sense and builds on what we've done before. And the other piece is going the opposite direction would be taking logs and exporting them just as raw logs out of the province entirely, instead of keeping them here when we do cutting and adding value and creating jobs in local communities.
And the irony of exporting logs is that it's been well documented that from exporting logs to selling only canned, marginally processed squared trees to other countries, in those other countries, they're remanufactured into high valued end products and sold back to us. What kind of economics is that? That doesn't.
Well, I've seen also that recently the changes in the building code allows for taller timber construction. So we're making buildings using bigger pieces of wood, not just a few stories, multiple story buildings, which creates, I would think, an opportunity in British Columbia for us to make those engineered products and to create value. You can cut a smaller tree and engineer it into a bigger engineered product that creates opportunity for using wood in really valuable construction projects. But that still has to be connected to managing the forest properly to begin with, right?
Yes, with cross-laminated wood or mass wood products have a real potential, provided they are subservient to a nature-based plan that provides for networks of protection and building climate change resilience, protecting community watersheds, looking after the whole suite of benefits. The danger in what's going on with that, though, and that's what you referred to earlier, that people are now calling the bioeconomy, is there's projections that we could increase the cut from 58 million cubic meters a year to 220 million cubic meters a year, and that's not where we want to go, because that's just you cutting younger and younger and smaller trees to fuel a dead end that will, because of the climate emergency, come at us within 2 decades if we're not careful.
So that raises 2 points. One is that in terms of the market itself, that what the forest provides should dictate what's going to be available in terms of forest products, rather than saying, well, this is what the market wants, so let's go find that from the forest. And that was a lesson that we learned and worked really hard on at the Ecolumber Co-op, taking the wood that was perhaps less valuable from a traditional point of view, maybe smaller trees, more knots, but finding markets that appreciated that, finding furniture makers that could use that, finding a whole range of products that could be made from that wood, rather than just assuming the only thing that's value is old growth. So the decision making goes from protecting the forest, putting a nature-based plan in place, and then determining the products that come out of that. And that's related to the allowable cut. So you just talked about increasing the allowable cut, this crazy idea from 50 to 200 million cubic meters a year. Now, again, the nature-based plan determines the cut, as opposed to the cut determining what kind of planning happens on the ground.
Yes, there's a couple of simple but true adages here. One is that if you were going to practice ecologically and socially responsible forestry, the forest has to dictate to the mill, not the other way around. And it also brings into play a well understood relationship too, that good ecology is good economics, because economics in its heart are people relating to people, providing the goods and services people need. It's not a corporate financial appraisal. It's not a one-year profit and loss statement of a charity. That's what economics is. And so if we're focusing on needs that way, we'll make plenty of jobs, and we'll have the basket of benefits that comes from healthy forest ecosystems that are the main support system we have in this province.
And then we'll have jobs for the longer term, so there's the stability, and we get away from the boom and bust plague that mill towns have often had to suffer through, and so that creates a long-term stability in communities. People can then plan their lives, plan the industries that are that dependent and connected with the forest, and at the same time, they're better paying jobs as stability happens for over the longer term. So the economic piece really is about what you've always said about forests, which is we need an ecological timeline, a long-term planning horizon, certainly not a year, as you just said, but certainly also not even 5 years or even an election cycle.
No, and the interesting thing about the economies we're talking about, these ecosystem-based economies, are also community-based economies. They're not driven by outside investments. They're driven by communities. And economists economic research shows us that the only economies that have been sustainable over time have been place-based, community-based economies. And so that's what we're designing here. And another interesting thing about it is the way our quote unquote economic system works right now is we have to generate these huge profits to make it seem like it's working, because we're paying for a whole bunch of infrastructure that we don't need. So in a community economy, jobs become the profit, not corporate financial appraisals.
Right, jobs and public benefits that come from it,
Yeah.
including clean water in the watershed. So we're having a hard time disagreeing on much of anything. I'm gonna ask you about another related topic, of course, is how does all what we've been discussing fit into advancing reconciliation in a meaningful way with Indigenous people?
Well, I would start by saying over the 40 years of working on this concept of nature-based planning, my real mentors have been Indigenous people, from the Innu and Nitassinan and Labrador to the Haida and Haida Gwaii, and I owe them a huge debt of thanks for the Indigenous knowledge that has infused my thoughts about this. And so I think we start there. I think we stop thinking that science is the god of all knowledge, Western science, and has all the truths. I think it's a very useful tool. It gives us lots of information, but I think we need to, in reconciliation, to go to Indigenous nations and ask them, which will take some time because there's trust building, for them to provide us with their knowledge about how this system works, and do it not as an afterthought, but do it as them working together in a co-management kind of way to frame what happens on their lands and us as visitors to their lands. And that, I think, though, that we all have to be realistic about that. So I think that can lead reconciliation in a way that we can't even really predict right now, because I think once Indigenous people are engaged in that, they're going to provide us with a lot of things we haven't thought about. And I think an overarching principle right now, too, is to say that the climate emergency and the need to heal Earth has to be at the focus. And so I think that needs to can lead reconciliation in a way that becomes really meaningful. And all of a sudden, we are working cooperatively without systemic racism, without systemic biases towards where the knowledge came from.
Well, what you just said at the beginning there about the importance of trust, that applies to any human relationship. And if we approach it by building trust and strengthening the relationship, instead of in the alternative having a divide and conquer strategy through treaties, or having another situation where a resource development company offers Indigenous people money to go along with something, and recognizing that an Indigenous community may have fewer choices and therefore it's not really a fair bargain. So instead of having these divide and conquer strategies, let's proceed with what you said initially, which is developing trust and strengthening the relationship. And that, as you say, might take time, and that's okay, because we have to think of things over the long term to heal the relationship with the planet and with each other.
And Cam, something that you know a lot about and can bring a wonderful approach to the table is respecting Indigenous law. Not just saying, well, it's the law, get out of our way, as happened to the Wet'suwet'en, as happened to Indigenous people across this province and around the world. And I think that those Indigenous cultures, from my non-Indigenous point of view, are honored by that approach. and that will be we have to also stop trying to hoard power and stop trying to fear change. And in fact, we need to embrace the fact that together we're going to do a lot better than apart.
Right, right. And as you say, we live in a place that doesn't just have the European legal systems that were brought here, the common law and the civil law system. There's also been thousands of years of indigenous law here. We have a truly multi-jural legal system. And that indigenous law isn't static. It wasn't set in written down and set into one place at one period of time and doesn't change. It evolves just as our legal system evolves, and indigenous law maybe now needs to be articulated and by each nation in terms of what it means today in contemporary society, and respecting that indigenous law that exists and never went away is the starting place for an equal relationship that builds trust and over long term creates lasting solutions, I would suggest.
Yes, I agree with you, and it's time. It's past time to get back to that.
So it is time to coming up on about 6:30. So maybe what we'll do is move to some questions that have been submitted. Anna, do you want to take over asking some questions?
Love to jump in here. So thanks to everyone who sent in questions in advance. And if anyone wants to send in more questions, we've got the chat open. And hopefully we'll cover everyone. But if there's anybody that's missed, we'll make sure that Cam and Herb follow up after the event. So first, Glenn from Kamloops. What can the government do now to immediately advance the transition to the future you have been describing?
Well, thank you, Glenn, for that question, and we'll both provide some thoughts on it. What I would say immediately, even before the long-term relationship building and long-term planning that Herb and I have been discussing, are some immediate actions. You're quite right, Glenn. So one would be to stop cutting the last remaining old growth. We need to do that immediately. We can require the nature-based planning and move down that route. We can ban the export of raw logs that we've talked about and immediately start supporting the value-added industries that take the wood that is available from a nature-based plan, not from market decisions, but from what the forest can actually provide from an ecosystem point of view. Take those wood products and add as much value, meaning public value, not meaning jobs, meaning creative, meaning innovation, meaning stable industries in local communities. And so those things we can do right away, and that sets us very solidly down the path towards what Herb and I were discussing.
I would also just add to that the amount of restoration and building climate change resilience, we're probably doing something in the order of 1 to 5% of what we need to do. So there's a huge opportunity there for us to interact with forests in a responsible way, not focusing on timber or forests as logs standing vertically, but focusing on forests as ecosystems that provide a myriad of benefits. And if we do that, we'll get some byproduct timber from it that goes down the road you just described, Cam. So there's a huge, huge opportunity there to do that.
And the question about timing too is an interesting one, because the question, Glenn, was what do we do immediately, I think you asked. And the longer we go on and not do something, the fewer options we have. So 30 years ago when I started grappling with these issues, and earlier than that, Herb, when you did, there were more options because we had there were fewer intrusions into the land, there were greater areas of undisturbed landscape and healthier forests in the province, and then all the things we've talked about were happening, including climate change, which exacerbated and all this and sped it up. But now we have fewer choices than we did before. But we can still do things immediately to get back on the right path.
Perfect. So maybe this relates to that, and that's things that we can do to put us on the right path. And that is Katarina from Nelson, who asks, what role do ownership structures play in this transition?
Great question, Katarina. Well, so ownership structures are really important. We've talked so far about public benefits. 95% of the land is public land, therefore they should be managed for public benefits. And yet we have private interests that are demanding what's going to be happening in the forest. So instead, shared ownership structures, whether they're cooperatives such as the one that I was involved with and started the Ecolumber Co-op, whether it's community forests, whether it's community ownership, or tenure ownership held by the community instead of a private interest, is really important because it removes the myopic profit growth imperative and switches to these public benefits. And one example I'll give that Herb, of course, is even more familiar with than I am, which is the Harrop Proctor Community Forest just east of Nelson. And this came out of a long battle between loggers and in the community and people that were against the logging for various reasons. But people came together recognizing they need to protect the drinking water in the watershed above their community. And so they acquired a tenure for a community forest. Herb and the Silva Forest Foundation prepared the ecosystem-based plan, the nature-based plan for there. It's now been implemented, and that license, the community forest license, has been renewed. And not only is it incredibly successful in a model of ecoforestry and what we've been talking about on the land, it's also financially profitable. So there's a mill and a kiln and a molder, create a wide variety of wood products, the ones that are available from an ecosystem-based plan, make those wood products available in the community. So financially it's profitable. And of course all the public benefits are available there, including the safe drinking water which brought the community together.
And I just add a couple of things about the Harrop Proctor example. And that's that per tree cut, there's 5 to 7 times the number of jobs produced compared to a tree cut in industrial forestry. And the other thing about ownership arrangements, I think that we need to move quickly to have a public administration and public control of the forests that dominate this province, that 95% of the forests. At one time, giving, which we did, that those public forests to private interests may have made sense. It no longer makes sense. And so governments have the power through a proper transition that needs to happen quickly to get those forests back in control of the public through a network, I think, of community forest boards that are overseen by the proper legislation and standards that start with nature-based planning and go through the value-added processes that we've been talking about. So I think that ownership structure is way past due, and I think it can be done in a very dignified, practical way.
Sure, and you put it in, sorry, Anna, just one other comment on that what Herb was saying, it made me think about the fact that the forest industry, back in the 90s, when I was getting involved in it, what represented about 17% of GDP, using that as certainly not the only metric, but one measure of how important it is to that measure of the economy, and now it's about 2%. So there's an opportunity to revitalize this and make sure that we're talking about are these public benefits. And then to weave into what you were saying, Herb, about community forests is, of course, indigenous community forests.
Yes.
That's great. Well, we'll keep going, and we'll make our answers also economize on words as well, because we've got a lot of really great questions coming in.
Okay.
So it's good that there's so much engagement. Okay, so going to combine 2 related questions here. So one was from Thomas, who I believe is a forester in training and a CAPM. And Thomas said, I work in the forestry sector. I'm well aware of its shortcomings and the need for science-based land management. However, I don't see widespread changes occurring with the BC Greens taking less than 17% of the vote and 3 seats, especially when these votes are concentrated in urban ridings. What campaign strategies or policy pieces do you have to gain support in the resource-dependent rural communities in BC? And then related to that was Bill Marshall's question in the chat, which was, can you talk about how we would talk to forestry workers, mill workers, and logging truck drivers, the most numerous workers? How can we bring them on side?
Okay, well, great questions. I'll offer some thoughts first about how to expand the beyond 3 seats. And so to do that, the Green Party needs a leader who can attract a really strong and diverse slate of candidates from across the province. And in order to do that work of attracting candidates from across the province, we need a leader who's going to be comfortable speaking with all British Columbians, all types of people. So you asked Thomas, about the resource-dependent communities in rural areas of the province, for example. And I've worked with foresters and loggers and mill and kiln operators and reman facilities and places, and also Indigenous people, and also people that are concerned about their drinking water, as I just mentioned, are concerned about the climate emergency, and also with people involved in tourism and other sort of non-timber forest uses. So someone needs to be able to speak to all these interests and bring them together and inspire a vision going forward. So that's an important piece. And you also asked about the policies. Well, an important policy, of course, is supporting the innovation that we've been talking about, which creates those stable jobs. And this gets to the second question about how do you talk to people whose economic livelihood is tied to the industrial model, perhaps more than others involved in the woods. And the answer is to transition to a place where there's going to be stability. That boom and bust economy that I've talked about before is real. The fact that the GDP has dropped from 17% to 2% is real, and it's not the only metric, but it means the jobs are more threatened, they're more temporary, and there's more anxiety in families and in communities about this, and that's very real. And the answer to move forward is to create a stable model that we've been talking about with community forests, with community ownership of resources, with Indigenous people involved, and with an innovative approach to wood products that creates that stability that we all want. And as Herb said earlier, the joy that comes from restoring forests is something to be proud of.
The only thing that I would add is what I hear you describing, Cam, I really like, and that's get the local forest workers, the local people involved in forests, involved in the decision making. Understand what they need and take that forward. They're oftentimes forgotten in that.
Great, thanks, Herb. We'll move on to another question from Jacinta, which is, what are your plans, if any, for the continuing devastation by the pine beetle in BC's forests?
Well, nature-based planning would be my answer to that. Herb, you want to build on that?
Yes, well, I'll just, there's a lot to say there, but what happened, the climate emergency, global heating is the primary cause of the pine beetle epidemic. That was caused by our forest management practices, from large-scale clear cutting to fire suppression, that have homogenized and simplified the landscape, and high grading all the primary and old growth forests. If we had landscape level plans that had protected that diversity, they would have protected in those older forests and intact forests carnivorous beetles that eat mountain pine beetles when they try to fly through the forest. So we wonder how over millennia things were in balance. Well, that was because we had heterogeneous diversity in our forests. And a nature-based plan is how to get there. It can reshape that diversity, focus where we do restoration so we can bring back that diversity and heterogeneity.
Perfect, thanks, Herb. All right, next question, we're moving along here. So, from David in the chat, it seems that the timber industry is far too complicated for the public to provide oversight. And that a radical revamp of governance is required. Could this be done without a flight of investment? Good question.
So the interesting thing about what you say is that the complicated systems are the stable systems, and what we're talking about is moving away from a homogeneous, simplified system that says the forest is actually only good for one thing. It's making 2x4s or commodities that we make the diverse ecosystems into a very simple, low-value commodity and export it. That's actually quite a simple economy. Instead, what we're talking about doing is creating a more complex economy that has the stability. So the stability is not just in the forest as we restore it and strengthen it. The stability is in the economic system because there's a diversity of businesses and a diversity of added value and community ownership and benefits that come from this that creates that stability. Now, how it can be managed is, I agree with what Herb said earlier about a network of these community forest boards. And local decisions can be made within that context, as long as there's a nature-based plan that's the basis of the industry, then local communities can make those decisions themselves about what's happening. And we've got a huge range, as you know, of forest types in the province, and a huge range, therefore, of commercial activities that can take place in those forests. So the diversity of the economic system mirroring a strengthening of diversity in the ecosystems is the way to move forward. And local communities can manage that under an umbrella that ensures we have nature-based planning. Herb?
I'll give you two quick examples of the fact that there won't be a flight of capital. First of all, the Harrop Proctor Community Forest. There was no flight of capital there. In fact, people have invested in the Harrop Proctor Community Forest. And now when people want high quality wood products in the West Kootenays, that's where they go. I've also had the privilege to work with the Heklip Nation, which is across the river from Lillooet for the past 30 years. They have a community forest subject to a just and honorable resolution of the land question, but they have a community forest that they operate doing ecocultural restoration. They've never sold a log. It's about restoring the cultural needs and the ecological health of the forest. And they employ a staff in the neighborhood that ranges from 6 to 10 people, a good chunk of those year round. So that the flight of capital is what industry would like us to believe. That won't happen. In fact, the opposite will happen.
Yeah, I was just going to say the opposite has happened. So that's what the boom and bust thing is all about. That when that simplified commodification process ends in a particular place, capital is mobile. Capital goes somewhere else, and the town is left not being able to respond to that. Whereas what we're talking about will create that stability. And it's true with all kinds of resource industries, but the answer is to have this local community control and this diversity of economic activities supporting diverse and healthy ecosystems will insulate us from that capital scare.
Thanks both. So Kim Darwin, who's another candidate in this election, has joined the Zoom call, which is great. And she says 5 big companies control 80% of the license currently. So I guess the question, Cam and Herb, is how does that factor into the transition to the future forestry that you've both been describing?
Well, first of all, welcome, Kim. Great. Thank you for joining, and great question, of course. So part of the answer, the concentration of capital, is just an exacerbation of that exact same thing. Concentration of capital, and there's the fewer companies in the timber industry today is because they want economies of scale. They just want to make more profits as they deplete the resource and have lower commercially valued trees available to them. The only way to do that, to make a profit with a commodity whose price is determined globally beyond our borders, is to make the mills more efficient, which means lower employment, it means more capital, it means concentration of wealth, and that doesn't help anybody. That doesn't help the people in this province that are looking for work, it doesn't help the forests that we need for climate emergency, and it doesn't help the ecosystems we need for biodiversity, let alone the communities that need stability or a reconciliation with Indigenous people.
And I would say that the tenure system, which has facilitated that control, it needs to end. And one of the most classical examples of that in Kim's question, or Kim's point, is that 5 companies control 80% of the forest. And you know what? They sell those rights, those public forests, they sell them between themselves for millions of dollars. Now, I ask you if a reasonable, or all of the people listening, a reasonable wealth tax would both do away with that, and do we need any more evidence of why we need public forests back in the hands of a publicly accountable agency? I don't think so.
Great, thank you both. Let's see. Megan from Courtney/Comox says, racism is deeply entrenched in our economic, political, and social justice system. Do you really think BC communities will accept leadership of First Nations leaders?
So one of the things that I remember very clearly about working with the Silva Forest Foundation and doing ecoforestry was working with woodlots in particular, family-owned woodlots owned by white people in particular places in the province, and had never really had communicated with the indigenous people within whose traditional territory the woodlot existed. And part of the certification standards that we were advancing required free and informed consent from those indigenous people. And so because of those standards, communication opened up. And it was incredible, amazing how these relationships strengthened. They started talking about it. They found common ground. There was agreement. And suddenly, just the fear of the other was broken down. And for me, that was one of the most powerful experiences in working with certification in ecoforestry. And then after a while, that systemic racism that you're talking about is essential to address. But it happens with the trust that Herb had talked about earlier and building these relationships.
And keep in mind that racism is a construct. People who further racism have to work really hard at that. And so all you have to notice is young kids playing together of different races. They don't see anything. And so we need to, as you've said, Cam, we not only need to get back to nature and be part of nature, we need to get back to being together with ourselves. And if we give that a chance, I think that racism will disappear.
Great, thank you, Herb. So I believe her name is Serena. Serena asks, the earlier points about learning from Indigenous knowledge, law, and relationship with the forest brings to mind the particular vulnerabilities of Western red cedar trees, a species that's hugely significant to coastal First Nations, yet seems to be bearing the brunt of both logging and climate change. Do you have any insights into how red cedar might be a rallying point of the movement?
Well, red cedar is one of those species, of course, that is not only magnificent and beautiful and culturally important to many Indigenous people, but also incredibly valuable. And so there's additional commercial pressure, especially on old growth cedar, to cut it. And it's another reason why we need to resist that pressure and look to other values and so on. So cedar is a symbolic tree as well, and commercially very important for communities, but it's one that we can protect and still have smaller cedar trees. It doesn't have to be the massive cedar trees that are cut. There are smaller cedar trees that from a nature-based plan allows additional value to be taken from that. And I can remember at the Ecolumber Co-op having second growth cedar, smaller cedar trees, maybe from older forests, but the smaller ones that were taken out in an ecosystem-based plan and made into, again, very valuable products that we don't require cutting the old growth. But it starts by saying, let's do a nature-based plan. We begin by focusing on what to leave, not on what to take. And what's to leave is that the old growth, incredibly tempting and valuable from a commercial perspective, but ecologically irreplaceable, old growth cedar.
And I think that red cedar is bearing the brunt of a lot of the climate change that's happening right now, the drying and the heating. And I think nature-based plans can both help build resilience as much as we know how within those stands, and also do that in a way that we hope creates climate change refugia if it's designed right. And there's interesting science around that. That gets into the whole field of principled adaptive management, and that's a key part of nature-based planning.
Great, thank you. So Nancy asks, what can be done now to stop logging in the old growth Fairy Creek watershed?
So Nancy, that's the great question. Of course, the answer is immediately to ban logging old growth. And the other thing that we can do in this group that are on this call, of course, is elect a leader of the Green Party who's committed to doing that and sends a very strong political message that this is going to end. And therefore, there's more momentum, there's political momentum to stop that. So what's happening in the protests in Fairy Creek doesn't have to continue because we can stop logging, ban old growth logging immediately.
I second that.
Fantastic. So Misa from Vancouver asks, what does value added mean in this context?
So the definition of value added is one of those things that could be interpreted in a way that no longer has the meaning it used to. The way when I speak of value added, I'm talking about the things we've discussed earlier. So let's focus on what to leave, not on what to take in the forest, create a nature-based plan. And the wood we do take out, you create local jobs that value that wood that the forest produces, make it into as commercially valuable a product, but also value in terms of the number of jobs that are produced from that, the stability for that type of use of the wood over the longer term. And it's unfortunately been distorted, those to sometimes mean other things, like, oh, the only thing we can do is what Herb talked about earlier, this idea of increasing the cut to 220 million cubic meters a year, creating biofuels, selling them to Europe, essentially burning forests. And biofuel is not a value added. It's the opposite. It's exactly what we should not be doing with the climate emergency staring in our face. We can't be burning our trees. What we need to do is, as I've discussed. So value added is, what it really means is having the communities decide what's the best way we can create public benefits from this forest. That's what value added means.
And to give you just to give the question asker a kind of simple example, if you had a cubic meter of 2x4s or a board foot of 2x4s, that might be worth $3 or $4 a board foot. If you take that same board foot, which is 1 inch by 12 inches by 12 inches, and you make it into molding that goes around your doors or windows, suddenly it's $20 a board foot. And you've employed 4 or 5 other people in that same process. And then if you use that molding with a few other pieces of wood to build cabinets, you can keep 5 to 10 people busy year round with 3 or 4 logs. So that's how you add value.
And to reinforce that, one of the things we really worked hard at the Ecolumber Co-op, and is key to value added, is this idea that you change market expectations. So we'd work with architects and designers and say, you know what, you don't need to put clear old growth wood in this project. You can use wood that has knots in it because trees have branches, therefore they have knots. That's okay, you could do that. And when architects and designers start specifying this, suddenly it's okay and there's more uses for wood that otherwise would have had a lower value. And to emphasize that, one really important thing is to tie the story of where the wood comes from to the final product, to say that this isn't a commodity. This is a real forest in a particular place with a community and a history, and that's embedded in this product. And that's how we can talk about the markets for BC wood products rather than just competing in this silly, ultimately losing game in which we try and produce wood for lower than anywhere else in the world.
Great, thanks. Those are really good examples. So Alex in the chat asks, how can local environmental groups compete with the paid lobbyists that have the constant ear of government representatives?
By electing a strong leader of the Green Party who's going to listen to them. You know, the idea of lobbyists deciding for 2% of the GDP for an industry that is inherently unstable and unproductive for the province has to end. I can remember being called an enemy of BC by the government for trying to protect forests. And Herb, I know you remember that well. But that's got to stop because the benefits that we're talking about, the public benefits, completely overwhelm the private interests that lobbyists are trying to pursue. So you talk about activists, and I would expand that definition to include not just environmental activists, but people that care about their communities, people that care about their families, people that care about the long-term next generations and the future of Earth, and Indigenous people who have been here long before we were and did a great job of stewarding the forest. So the lobbyists are the ones who should be outnumbered, and it's anomalous for them to have any power at all. So that's my answer to that. And Herb, you probably want to, I'm sure you have something to add to that.
Well, I think that that you said it right. We need a strong leader like yourself, and we need a party that recognizes communities, not just other lobby groups, not just industry lobby groups, but for that matter, environmental lobby groups. I mean, we need to get back to that new relationship with forests and with each other, and that's a really key point in making that happen. And then that will empower more people to step up in communities.
Great. Okay, we'll see how many more we can squeeze in here. So Tom asks, greater conservation equals greater protection and stewardship. Is this an obvious starting point to promote cohesion in the community, or is this statement too controversial?
So conservation is part of it, and of course that creates greater cohesion, but as we've said too, it's because of the choices, we've closed the doors on choices that we had a few decades ago, and now we need to spend a lot of time working on restoration. But that creates cohesion in the community because, as Herb has mentioned, restoration work makes one feel proud. It's an investment in the future of the forest and the planet and the community in which one works, and it's something that then creates all kinds of new opportunities. And when a community is strong and stable, when a community has those opportunities and feels proud and undivided about what it's doing, all kinds of things emerge, all kinds of opportunities come up. And that's where the innovation will come. It's when we have our back against the wall because we're afraid, the only thing we can do is try and run back to the way it was. But when we move momentum in the other direction, unforeseen opportunities come up, which creates a really positive future, a positive energy, and I like your word cohesion in the community for a stronger future.
All right. Well, Herb, anything to add?
No, I'm good with that.
Okay, great. Next question from Ian. Herb, this is directed to Herb. Herb, is there now good evidence of better long-term revenues and jobs from ecosystem-based conservation plan forestry versus current cut-and-run logging practices?
Oh, there's lots of evidence. I mean, we've given you a couple of examples tonight. Herb Proctor is a shining example of that. But one of the experiments that was done on public land in the early 90s, Jim Smith, who's a retired forester, and Tom Milne, who both worked for the Vernon Forest Service, ran a regional log sort yard. It's where the first certified wood came from. The Silva Forest Foundation certified it. So the Small Business Forest Enterprise Program asked us to make a nature-based plan for that. We did that. It generated more jobs in the logging end of it. But the sort yard was an amazing success. It was such a big success that the industry lobbied hard for a couple of years to finally shut it down because it embarrassed the province. There were multiple times more stumpage made or revenues made per tree cut. They revealed that by hand scaling every log, they actually accounted for 12 to 15% more volume. So the current scaling system we use is giving industry wood free. And it all went, the reason the revenues came so high from it was because people who wanted to build a sailboat could go bid high on high quality wood, and the province got the benefit for it. And a whole lot of workers got the benefit of the jobs. So that's a quick answer to that.
Thank you, Herb. So to close us up, we're going to highlight, we were going to highlight Pat, but he just logged off. So we'll have to get back to him later. But that actually works out okay because I think we're coming to the top of the hour. So we have this chat and we'll make sure that after this event, we'll go through all of it and have Herb and Cam respond to everybody personally. So thank you so much, everyone, for participating. And with that, we'll turn it over to Cam, who will read us out.
Great. Well, thank you, Anna, for facilitating all those questions, and thanks everybody for your excellent questions. And always a joy, Herb, of course, to hear of your insights and your passion. Thanks for joining us and sharing this. This campaign is about new relationships with nature and new relationships with with each other, and this gathering tonight is part of moving in that direction. So thank you for helping to build that momentum, and stay tuned. We'll have more of these chats with other people over the coming weeks, and I look forward to seeing you there. And in the meantime, please visit campbrewer.ca and join us, and otherwise, have a great evening. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Night.
God, they had a troll on their chat room.
That's